I found reform school records from 1885 that document systematic changes in children that had nothing to do with behavioral correction. I was researching juvenile justice history when these documents surfaced in a collection of institutional records housed at the state archives, preserved in climate-controlled storage alongside thousands of pages of documentation chronicling America's progressive era attempts to address social problems through scientific institutional management. Standard historical research examining how American society addressed juvenile delinquency during the progressive reform era, trying to understand the evolution of child welfare institutions and their impact on both individual development and broader social organization during a period of unprecedented urbanization and industrial growth. The research had led me through extensive documentation of humanitarian reform movements that characterized late 19th century American social policy. Progressive reformers genuinely believed that scientific methods could solve complex social problems through proper institutional design, systematic intervention, and careful study of human behavior and development. The Reform School movement represented the intersection of humanitarian concern for disadvantaged youth and scientific confidence in institutional solutions to social problems that had previously been addressed through punishment, neglect, or informal community management. The Reform School records I discovered weren't from typical juvenile correctional facilities that historians routinely study when examining progressive-era child welfare reform and the transition from punishment-based to treatment-oriented approaches to juvenile justice. Different institutions entirely. Specialized state reform schools throughout New England and the Mid-Atlantic that operated during 1885 under the direct supervision of educational reformers, child welfare experts, and institutional administrators who claimed to be implementing cutting-edge scientific approaches to juvenile rehabilitation and character development through systematic institutional programming that would address root causes of delinquency rather than simply responding to problematic behavior. The official narrative describes reform schools as progressive institutions designed to address juvenile delinquency by providing education, vocational training, and moral instruction that would transform troubled youth into productive citizens. Children sent to these institutions were supposed to receive comprehensive rehabilitation that addressed the social, educational, and behavioral factors that had led to their delinquent activities. The Reform School movement represented enlightened thinking about child development and social intervention that emphasized treatment rather than punishment. But the institutional records from 1885 document systematic programs that had little to do with education, vocational training, or moral development. Instead, these facilities conducted comprehensive assessments and modifications of children that focused on physical characteristics, cognitive capabilities, and behavioral patterns in ways that suggest scientific study and systematic alteration rather than traditional rehabilitation or character reform. The intake procedures documented in these records reveal institutional priorities that fundamentally contradicted the humanitarian mission of juvenile reform that progressive-era reformers promoted through public advocacy and legislative lobbying efforts. Children entering these specialized reform schools underwent extensive physical examinations that measured not just general health status or medical conditions that might interfere with education and rehabilitation, but conducted detailed anatomical assessments, including precise bone structure measurements, muscle development documentation, facial feature analysis, cranial measurements, and what institutional administrators described as constitutional indicators of character and intelligence that suggested genetic or hereditary traits rather than environmental factors contributing to delinquent behavior. These comprehensive physical examinations weren't medical assessments designed to address health problems that might interfere with education or rehabilitation programming. Instead, they represented systematic documentation of physical traits and characteristics that were catalogued in detailed files for purposes that the institutional records don't clearly explain, but that suggest anthropological or biological research rather than medical care or rehabilitation planning. Children were measured, photographed, and documented as specimens for systematic study rather than patients receiving medical evaluation. The examination procedures included detailed documentation of what administrators called developmental anomalies, or advanced characteristics that distinguished certain children from typical population parameters. Multiple records describe children with unusual height for documented age, advanced bone development suggesting different chronological age than claimed, facial bone structure inconsistent with claimed ethnic background, or muscle development patterns indicating systematic physical training or conditioning. These observations suggest that many children processed through these institutions possessed physical characteristics that institutional authorities found scientifically interesting rather than displaying behavioral problems requiring correction. Individual intake files preserve disturbing examples of the dehumanizing approach that these institutions took toward children who were supposedly receiving humanitarian care and scientific rehabilitation. Child 147 is documented as male, estimated 12 years, exhibits advanced skeletal development and muscular coordination inconsistent with documented background, demonstrates knowledge of technical subjects not available through normal educational opportunities, requires systematic assessment of intellectual capabilities and behavioral modification potential. Child 203 appears in records as female, estimated 10 years, unusual cranial measurements and facial structure, demonstrates linguistic capabilities in multiple languages, displays social organization skills inappropriate for documented age and background, suitable for advanced behavioral conditioning programs. The educational assessments conducted at these institutions went far beyond evaluating academic skills or identifying learning difficulties that would inform appropriate instructional programming for children who had missed educational opportunities due to poverty, family disruption, or social circumstances that led to delinquent behavior. Children were subjected to systematic testing of intellectual capabilities using methodologies that measured not just cognitive abilities and academic achievement levels, but psychological characteristics, social attitudes, and behavioral tendencies that institutional administrators catalogued systematically in detailed files rather than addressing through educational intervention or remedial instruction. These assessments documented individual traits and capabilities using testing methods that seemed designed to identify unusual characteristics rather than address educational needs or behavioral problems that would typically be the focus of rehabilitation programming. Children were tested for memory capabilities that exceeded normal parameters, problem-solving skills that demonstrated advanced logical reasoning, and technical knowledge in subjects like mathematics, engineering, and natural sciences that wouldn't be available through typical educational opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The testing procedures included systematic evaluation of what institutional records describe as social, organization capabilities, leadership potential, and group coordination skills that were measured and documented rather than developed through educational programming or social skill instruction. Several assessment files document children who demonstrated advanced understanding of organizational hierarchies, sophisticated knowledge of group dynamics and social control methods, or leadership capabilities that exceed age-appropriate development patterns. These assessments suggest institutional interest in identifying children with advanced social and intellectual capabilities rather than addressing behavioral problems or educational deficiencies. Time equals 2 seconds / The systematic nature of these assessments and their focus on measuring rather than developing capabilities indicates that these institutions were conducting research on human development and behavioral characteristics rather than providing education or rehabilitation services. Children weren't students receiving instruction to address their academic and social needs. They were research subjects undergoing systematic evaluation to document their capabilities and characteristics for purposes that extended far beyond individual treatment or educational planning. Consider the daily schedules and institutional programs documented in these reform school records. Rather than educational classes, vocational training, or character development activities, children spent their time in systematic exercises that seemed designed to modify behavior through repetition and conditioning rather than teach skills or knowledge. Physical activities that emphasized conformity and coordination rather than health or recreation. Work assignments that focused on following precise instructions and maintaining consistent performance rather than learning useful trades or developing work skills. The institutional environment documented in these records prioritized control and systematic behavior modification over education or rehabilitation. Children were organized into numbered groups rather than age-based classes. Daily activities were scheduled according to institutional efficiency rather than educational effectiveness or individual development needs. Social interaction was limited to prevent the formation of relationships or group solidarity that might interfere with institutional objectives rather than encouraged as part of normal social development. The staff employed at these reform schools weren't educators, social workers, or juvenile justice professionals with conventional training in child development, educational methods, or rehabilitation techniques. Instead, the institutional employment records document systematic recruitment of individuals with backgrounds in experimental psychology, physical anthropology, and what the administrative files describe as applied social science, rather than child welfare, education, or traditional correctional work. These staff members conducted systematic observations and experimental interventions that focused on measuring, documenting, and modifying children rather than teaching academic skills, providing counseling, or addressing behavioral problems through established educational and therapeutic methods. The institutional methodology documented in these records reveals sophisticated understanding of behavioral modification techniques, psychological conditioning, and systematic environmental manipulation that far exceeded what would be necessary for addressing typical juvenile delinquency or providing basic education and vocational training to disadvantaged youth. Staff training materials preserve detailed instructions for implementing systematic behavioral conditioning protocols, environmental modification procedures, and psychological assessment and intervention techniques that were designed to alter fundamental aspects of children's cognitive and social development rather than address specific behavioral problems or educational deficiencies. The research protocols implemented at these institutions required staff to maintain detailed observational records documenting children's responses to various environmental conditions, social situations, and behavioral challenges that were systematically introduced to test psychological and social adaptation capabilities. These observations weren't conducted to assess individual needs or plan appropriate interventions. They were systematic data collection designed to understand human behavioral patterns and modification potential that could be applied to broader population management initiatives beyond individual treatment or rehabilitation. Correspondence between institutional administrators and external researchers reveals systematic sharing of data, techniques, and outcomes between different reform schools and with university-based researchers, government agencies, and private organizations interested in human behavior modification and social control methods. The children processed through these institutions weren't just receiving individual treatment. They were subjects of coordinated research designed to develop systematic approaches to population management and behavioral control that could be applied more broadly to social organization and institutional administration. The systematic nature of data collection and behavior modification documented in these records suggests institutional purposes that extended far beyond addressing juvenile delinquency or providing rehabilitation services. Children were subjects of systematic study and experimental intervention rather than students receiving education or clients receiving social services. The institutions functioned more like research facilities than schools or correctional programs. The children processed through these reform schools weren't typical juvenile delinquents who had committed crimes or exhibited behavioral problems that would normally result in institutional placement. Many are described in intake records as displaying unusual intellectual development, pitch 2%, advanced physical characteristics for documented age, or behavioral patterns inconsistent with typical social backgrounds. These weren't troubled youth needing rehabilitation. These were individuals with characteristics that institutional authorities found interesting for research purposes. The geographic distribution of these specialized reform schools reveals coordination between institutions that normally operated independently according to state and local jurisdictions. Facilities in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania simultaneously implemented similar programs using comparable methods and sharing information about techniques and outcomes in ways that suggest systematic coordination rather than independent development of similar approaches to juvenile reform. The timing of these programs coincides with broader implementation of scientific approaches to social management that characterized progressive-era reform movements. The 1880s marked intensive development of institutional methods for addressing social problems through systematic intervention and scientific management. But the reform school programs documented in these records went far beyond typical progressive reform initiatives and implemented systematic behavior modification techniques that wouldn't be recognized as legitimate educational or rehabilitation methods. Who was funding and coordinating these specialized reform school programs that operated alongside but separately from standard juvenile justice institutions? The records identify various state agencies, educational foundations, and research organizations as sources of support. But the level of systematic coordination and specialized expertise required to implement these programs suggests institutional networks with resources and capabilities that exceeded what typical child welfare or educational organizations could provide independently. The research conducted at these reform schools generated extensive documentation about physical characteristics, intellectual capabilities, and behavioral modification outcomes that was compiled systematically and apparently shared between institutions for comparative analysis. Children weren't just being processed through rehabilitation programs. They were being studied systematically as subjects of research designed to understand human development, behavioral modification, and social control methods that could be applied more broadly to population management. The correspondence between reform school administrators and external researchers reveals institutional interest in developing systematic methods for identifying and modifying individuals whose characteristics didn't align with social expectations or whose capabilities exceeded normal population parameters. The children in these institutions weren't being reformed in the traditional sense of addressing behavioral problems or character deficiencies. They were being studied and systematically altered to fit institutional expectations about appropriate human development and social behavior. The long-term outcomes for children processed through these reform schools differ significantly from typical rehabilitation programs that focused on education, vocational training, and community reintegration. Rather than developing skills and knowledge that would enable independent adult life, many children appear to have been prepared for continued institutional management or specialized work assignments that utilize their modified characteristics and capabilities rather than enabling normal social integration and family formation. The absence of follow-up documentation about successful rehabilitation and community reintegration raises questions about what happened to children who completed these specialized reform school programs. Unlike standard juvenile justice programs that generated extensive documentation of educational achievement, vocational placement, and adult outcomes that demonstrated program effectiveness and justified continued funding and operation, these specialized institutions produced minimal information about long-term results or successful rehabilitation. Some correspondence suggests that children processed through these reform schools were transferred to other institutional systems rather than returned to their families or communities. Adult children who had completed reform school programs appear in records of industrial facilities, specialized work, programs, or continued institutional management rather than achieving independent adult life and normal community integration that would typically indicate successful rehabilitation. The broader context of 1885 reveals similar specialized institutional programs throughout regions implementing progressive reform initiatives and scientific approaches to social management. Industrial schools, specialized training facilities, and experimental educational institutions throughout the Northeast and Midwest conducted similar systematic assessment and modification programs that focused on identifying and altering individual characteristics rather than providing traditional education, vocational training, or rehabilitation services. The pattern suggests systematic and coordinated development of institutional methods for managing populations whose characteristics were inconsistent with social expectations or whose capabilities required systematic modification to ensure appropriate integration into industrial society that demanded predictable, controllable, and productive workers. Progressive-era reformers weren't simply addressing juvenile delinquency, educational needs, or social problems through humanitarian intervention. They were implementing sophisticated programs designed to identify and systematically modify human characteristics and capabilities that might be problematic for social control and economic productivity in an increasingly industrialized and bureaucratically organized society. Time equals 2.5 seconds. Modern understanding of reform schools emphasizes their humanitarian mission and progressive approach to juvenile justice that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment, education over incarceration, and scientific treatment over moral condemnation of delinquent behavior. The 1885 institutional records reveal systematic programs that used humanitarian rhetoric and progressive ideology to justify scientific experimentation and systematic behavior modification that prioritized social control and institutional efficiency over individual development, human dignity, and genuine rehabilitation. The children sent to these specialized reform schools weren't typical juvenile delinquents needing behavioral correction, educational opportunities, or character development through moral instruction and vocational training. They were subjects of systematic institutional programs designed to study and modify human development in ways that would ensure their compliance with social expectations and industrial requirements that prioritized institutional control over individual autonomy and human flourishing. But in state archives throughout America, the institutional records remain as disturbing historical evidence. Documentation of systematic programs that processed children through comprehensive scientific assessment and systematic behavior modification, designed to ensure their compliance with complex social and economic systems that prioritized institutional control over individual development, human autonomy, and genuine rehabilitation. The question remains what these specialized reform school institutions were really reforming during the critical 1885 period. Not behavioral problems or character deficiencies that would normally justify comprehensive institutional intervention in children's lives. Not educational gaps or social disadvantages that could be addressed through legitimate educational and therapeutic programming. They were systematically reforming human beings themselves, conducting comprehensive modification of children to ensure their compatibility with institutional expectations and social systems. That required predictable, controllable, and productive population. Time equals 1 second greater than rather than independent individuals capable of autonomous thought, creative expression, and meaningful social action. That might challenge established authority or question institutional control over human development and social organization throughout American society. During this transformative period of institutional social development,